So last week we talked about prayer in the interior life. And I mentioned, we talked about how baptism makes us into something, right? Makes us completely and totally new. Then we talked about what it really means to have the divine indwelling and to have sanctifying grace. And so I kind of want to build on that this week because St. Paul says to put off your old nature, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and put on the new nature, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. So what is this new nature that he's talking about? Go ahead, Ken. Yes, so remember Andrew used the word theosis last week, which is Catholic theological speak for our share in the divine nature. So what does it mean to put on a new nature, right? We already talked about that nature is put on in baptism. Through sanctifying grace, we participate in that new nature. But God hasn't just given us a state of grace, right? But he's also given us the power to act in conformity with it. So to act with that nature, to do supernatural actions, all right? And that's what we're going to talk about this week. Because a nature without action, in a certain sense, right? We're given this new life, so that it demands that we be able to act in accord with it, right? Something that has no activity, we kind of call dead, right? And so this new life that we're given has to be preserved and developed and perfected. The problem, of course, is that it's still a gift and still not our nature. And so God has to be the instigator in all of that. And so if we have this super nature, we also have these supernatural powers. All right. And so what I want to do is to set this all up. I want to talk about virtue, and then we'll talk about natural or acquired virtue, and then we'll talk about infused virtue, the virtues that enable us to act with those new powers, and then the theological virtues. All right. So just kind of a review as to what virtue is. If you remember last semester, we talked about virtue when we talked about the moral life. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. You can go back and watch the video if you want. But here's the definition. And then what I want to do is sort of frame it. We framed it more in terms of the moral life before. What I want to do is frame it more in terms of what its purpose is. So the Catechism says a virtue is a habitual and firm disposition to do the good. It allows the person not only to perform good acts, but to give the best of himself. The virtuous person tends toward the good with all his sensory and spiritual powers. Remember last week, we talked about how virtue perfects not just our minds and our wills, but also our emotions, right? And that's what it's saying. He pursues the good and chooses it in concrete actions. All right, so it's a habit that makes us ready and prompt to do the good. But what I want you to think about virtue now is each virtue, of which I think St. Thomas says there's 64 different ones. Each of them perfects a different power. All right, so that's what I want you to think about, how virtue perfects certain powers. And each of them has sort of their proper object that they move towards, right? And the way you know if you have a virtue is if you're able to do it with ease, with promptness, and with pleasure, right? So I'm examining myself and I'm like, okay, do I have the virtue of temperance? Well, how easy, how promptly, and how much pleasure do I take in foregoing some pleasure, right? So that's the idea. So that's sort of the litmus test. Notice though that definition shows that our passions are intimately involved in this, and that it's meant to perfect the whole person. The other thing, just to sort of talk about, because we're going to talk a little bit about merit. Right? Does everyone understand sort of the idea behind merit? We need to talk about that for a second. Okay, so So without God, we can merit nothing before God. Right? But what he does is he enables us by using the supernature we're going to talk about to merit, which in a certain sense puts him in a position where he rewards us for our actions. Right? But we are only rewarded for supernatural in the next life for our supernatural actions. Right? We'll talk more about that in a minute. The other thing that I want to talk about, and this is more just, again, a really important part of the spiritual life, and we'll talk about why in a minute. Sometimes we think that when a thing is harder, that somehow is more is better, so somehow more meritorious, right? I remember seeing, I think it was Calvin and Hobbes. It was a cartoon where it's like Christmas time, and one of the characters is like, "Hey, I should get more for Christmas than you got because it's way harder for me to be good." Right. And what makes it pretty funny is that I think we tend to all think that way, right? But with virtue, it ought to be easy, prompt, and pleasing, right? So the higher the virtue, the easier it ought to be, right? And what we have to do is be convinced that that's more perfect than me kind of rumbling, stumbling through something that ought to be easy, pleasant, and prompt. All right. So when God gave us powers and perfected them, it's more pleasing to him when we use those powers in the way that he has decided. All right. So what I want to do then is just to focus on, for the rest of this today, is how virtues are essentially these habitual powers that perfect our actions, right? Make them more pleasing and more perfect, right? Like the temperate man is the one who's able to have this sort of ordered relationship with God, or with food, sorry. Okay, so that's just virtue in general, and then we're going to break down the different kinds of virtue, okay? So there's essentially, you can say there's 2 types or 3 types of virtues. And we'll talk about very briefly about acquired virtues, and then the 2 sets of infused virtues, which are the theological and then the infused moral virtues. Okay, so acquired virtues is sort of what we just call virtue. The Catechism says human virtues, calls them human virtues, are firm attitudes, stable dispositions, habitual perfections of intellect and will that govern our actions, order our passions, and guide our conduct according to reason and faith. They make possible ease, self-mastery, and joy in leading a morally good life. The virtuous man is he who freely practices the good. The moral virtues are acquired by human effort. That's the key. They are the fruit and seed of morally good acts. They dispose all the powers of the human being for communication with divine love. All right, so each of the acquired virtues, like I said, orders a particular power that we have towards their proper end, what they're supposed to be ordered towards, right? So for instance, like prudence orders our reason towards the practical good. Okay. Justice orders our relationship with our neighbor. Fortitude orders the response of our irascible appetite. Temperance, and we'll talk about that in a minute, temperance orders our concupiscible appetite. So they're called acquired because we can acquire them by our own power, okay? And it's when we talk about virtue, this tends to be what we mean. And they're acquired through repeated action, right? Repeated firm action. Remember that firm is a really important part, right? And they grow, the other part, they grow through our human power alone. A couple of other things which will help us to sort of understand, or at least put in relation to infused virtues. If you, somebody honest, right, who has the virtue of honesty lies, do they lose the virtue of honesty? No, right? Like they can repeatedly act against it and eventually get to the vice of dishonesty, but they don't lose the virtue, right? So it's not corrupted by a single act, right? the infused virtues are different, and we'll talk about that in a second. The acquired virtues also, in a certain sense, depend upon each other. Remember, I think we talked about last semester, we talked about the idea of like the wheel with the spokes, right? If you pull a spoke out of a wheel, the whole wheel collapses, right? So there's a certain sense in which all of the virtues depend upon each other, right? So the person who is prudent is really only prudent to the point of being where his courage stops, right? Because at a certain point, it comes to doing the right thing, and the right thing is really, really hard and requires courage. They may not do it. Okay, they're only so just to the extent that they're courageous, right? So each of the virtues has this sort of interdependency on each other, even though you can have an acquired virtue and not have another one. Okay, and like the example I've used with you guys before was, I used to hang out with a lot of bodybuilding guys, and these guys were really temperate when it came to eating, right? And they were doing it because it was healthy, but when it came to chastity, they were horrible. And so you would look at them and say, yeah, they definitely have the virtue of temperance with respect to food, but not with respect to chastity. Okay, and so in a certain respect, right? And we talked about before how some virtues are just seemingly easier for certain people in certain circumstances. But there is this sort of interdependency between the virtues. Okay. Yes, Connor.
So question about, did you say that you have an acquired virtue, it's easy, it's quick, and it's pleasurable? Take the example of like two kids in applications here. Like I imagine there are probably still some guys that, they were super disciplined about food. They probably complained about, I really wish I could have that donut. It wasn't like they're like, man, it's so awesome, I can't have that donut right now. So what does it mean? When we say there's pleasure, what do we mean by that? Most of the time we still say like, it's still difficult to be courageous or something.
Yeah, well, pleasure, it doesn't necessarily have to be felt bodily, right? So I think St. Thomas really uses pleasant, so it's pleasing to you, like you like it, and whether it feels good or not is like a different issue, right? Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, so that's acquired virtue, right? And that's, again, we spent a lot of time last semester talking about that, so that now we can sort of dive into infused virtue, how we use our supernature, all right? Okay, so definition first. An infused virtue is a good habit of the mind or will given to the soul by God and not acquired by the action of a human being. The theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity are always infused. The moral virtues are both acquired and infused. All right, so the divine life of grace develops in us. How does it grow in us? Well, under the form of the infused virtues, theological, infused, and then the gifts of the Holy Spirit, which we'll talk about later in the semester. So when we say, when I said the thing about sort of prudence, kind of guiding all, let's call the charioteer, all the virtues, right? In our natural virtues. So virtue is sort of governed by right reason. Well, infused virtue is governed by faith. All right, so we're going to see a certain parallel between the two. And then as we begin to talk about it, this will get a little more practical. But I do want us to sort of understand, that God is the one who gives us these virtues. All right. Okay, so I'm saying this, right? And so then you ask the natural question would be, well, what the heck is the point of acquired virtue then? Like, if we have to just operate with infused virtues, why do we need acquired virtues? Does anyone want to take a stab at that? Yeah, so there is a certain, because they're proportion to end, the end, that has something to do with it, but it's a little bit more than that. Because the acquired virtues aren't like the intellectual virtue of prudence, right? Governs your intellect too. Yes. Come. Say that again.
Grace perfects nature.
Yeah. So grace perfects nature, and everyone remember my speech about grace perfecting nature. How grace doesn't build upon nature, but it perfects it, right? Because Grace comes from all the way through. All right, so what do I mean by that? So the acquired virtues, their whole purpose is to move your faults out of the way so that grace becomes totally operative. Right? Remember, this is the most important thing. Like you grow in virtue so that all of your defects are out of the way so that grace can operate in you perfectly. Right? So this is why in the spiritual journey, I'm hoping that toilet flushing is not on the recording. I kind of feel like what I'm saying is like garbage or something, because every once in a while I'll say something and I'll hear a toilet flush. So you guys don't need to distract me. I supply all my own. Now I have no idea what I was going to say. So like this is why we start with the purgative way. All right, why the purgative way is really, really active in us, right? And why we really have to work to acquire virtues, because the supernatural virtue of, let's say, fortitude, right? Somebody who doesn't have the natural virtue of fortitude, somebody who doesn't just, have the virtue of courage, is there any way they're going to be a martyr? Probably not, right? Probably not. Now, can God still make a martyr out? Yes. But if you want the supernatural virtue of fortitude to be active in your life, if you want to stand up for the faith, you want to be a witness, you have to work the acquired virtue of fortitude so that all of your faults get out of the way. Okay. So in a certain sense, the acquired are subordinated to the infused, but they're important, right? We can't just live in like we're in heaven now. So you'll see, like, and St. Thomas talks about this when he talks about the 3 stages of interior life, how when we will only get so far in the purgative way until with our acquired virtues, and then God steps in and we have what's called the dark night, and then he works to perfect the rest of our virtues, our natural virtues, okay, by removing obstacles, right? So like, for example, right, like anyone who goes through like the dark night, patience is a really hard thing, right? To be patient. So God gifts the person with perseverance, right? So that they can grow in the virtue of patience. All right, so the key to understanding the relationship then is not that the infused virtues are somehow grafted on top of the natural virtues, but that the acquired virtues are there to push all of the obstacles that we have built up inside of us out of the way. All right. Okay, so now let's talk about the theological virtues, and then we'll now begin to talk about how we can actually use them and grow in them. Okay. All right, so definition from the Catechism: the human virtues are rooted in the theological virtues, which adapt man's faculties for participation in the divine nature. The theological virtues relate directly to God. They dispose Christians to live in a relationship with the Holy Trinity. They have the one and triune God for their origin, motive, and object. We'll talk all about that in a second. They're infused by God into the souls of the faithful to make them compatible of acting as his children and of meriting eternal life, which we already talked about. They are the pledge of the presence and action of the Holy Spirit and the faculties of the human being. There are 3 of them: faith, hope, and charity. All right, so recall what I said earlier about because we now have supernatural powers, we have to have, since we have this supernatural nature, we have to have supernatural powers. And so the Catechism says they're called theological for 3 reasons. The first, the obvious reason, is we would never know we had them without God telling us. All right, so they come from God. Is number 2, they're infused by God alone. And then number 3, they have God as their object. Okay, what does that mean? They have God as their object. What it means is that they are directly ordered to our relationship with God. Okay, and we'll talk about how that is in just a second. These virtues, while they unite us to God, aren't all equal. Remember, which is the greatest one? Charity, right? And we'll talk about why that is as well. But faith shows us God in eternal life, right? Hope promises us the possession of God, and love actually gives us the possession of God. right? Even in this life. So in this life right, in the natural order, right, it's always better to, in a certain sense, you have to know to love, right? And it's always better to know than to love. But when it comes to God, it's better to love than to know, because we can only see him as in a glass, or St. Paul says, you can only see him darkly as in a glass, dimly, right? He says dimly. So on one level, that seems a little strange, right? Yeah, but that's why God gives the gift of faith, right? But you don't. So we're going to talk about faith in just a second, and then this is where we'll begin to start unpacking some of these a little bit and make them our own. Okay, so I said earlier, we can acquire virtues. We can, by practicing them, they grow, right? The infused virtues don't grow when we practice them. Why is that? Yes, nothing you can do can make a virtue, an infused virtue, grow, because it's not under human power, right? But, and we'll talk about every one of these virtues, things you can do dispose you to receive more of them, okay? So that's one way they're different than the acquired virtues. The other way is, remember I said, if an honest person lies, he doesn't lose the virtue of honesty. If you sin mortally, you lose all of the infused virtues. And charity, you retain faith and hope, assuming you didn't sin against faith and hope. Right? And this is why, one of the reasons why the person who falls mortally and knows that where to go to fix that, confession, right? Because they haven't lost the virtue of faith and hope, right? All right, so that's the differences. All right, so let's talk about each of the virtues, and then we'll talk about how to grow in them, how to practice them, and all of that. All right, so faith. Faith is the theological virtue by which we believe in God and believe all that he has said and revealed to us, and that the Holy Church proposes for our belief, because he is truth itself. By faith, man freely commits his entire self to God. For this reason, the believer seeks to know and do God's will. The righteous shall live by faith. Living faith works through charity. Okay. So faith, in a certain sense, right, is a share in God's knowledge of himself. Right? So God has revealed it. Is it knowledge? Is belief different from knowledge? In what way, Tyler? Okay, so what he's saying is, and he's 95% of the way there, he said, now knowledge comes from sort of direct witnessing of a thing, whereas belief is assent to something that you didn't directly witness. Is that fair? Okay. So the 5% is actually the most important part, though. Because why would you assent to something you didn't see? Yeah, because you trust the person who said it. Right? That is so important. Right? What is faith then? Right? Faith ultimately, this is why we start the creed with I believe in God. That is not something you need to believe. I believe in God. You know why? Because you can know it. Right? First Vatican Council says by reason alone, you can know that God exists. Right? So when I say I believe in God in the creed, I'm saying something different. To believe in a person means that I believe everything that comes from their mouth. Right? Why do you believe that the Blessed Virgin Mary was immaculately conceived? Because God said it, and he can neither deceive nor be deceived. That's it. Like, you don't need any other reason other than the one who has spoken, the witness. That's it. Right? So faith, first and foremost, is trust in God that everything he speaks is truth. The truths absolutely matter, but in a certain sense, we're all like Peter at the end of John 6, right? You have the words of eternal life, whatever you say, fine. Right? This is why, like, this is a hard teaching, and the ones who trust Jesus stay, even if it's a hard teaching, because they believe the one who spoke it. All right, does that make sense? Right, so our faith is based in the fact, first and foremost, as to who said it. And the reason why we trust it is because he can't deceive us. Okay. So in a certain sense, right, and people would tell you differently, we can have more confidence in what we believe by faith in God than something we have directly seen or we directly know or direct knowledge. Okay, so trying to decide whether to go this direction or not. Okay, so the issue, right, then is, if that's true, right, if we believe divine truths not because of their reasonableness per se, but because God has spoken, now it becomes really important to know how God has spoken and how he speaks. Right? So let's see, this is one of those arguments for infallibility, by the way, right? Because if you were only saved by faith, right? And faith ultimately is trust in that what God has said, and what God has said is true. Well, without infallibility, you will never know what God has said is true. Okay. So this is why God has set up an infallible protection for his word. Okay. Okay, so faith then, in a certain sense, I said, gives us a share in God's knowledge of himself. So we're sort of united to God and by the way of our intellects then, okay? Now, in the end, right, all that's left is charity, right? Faith passes away when you see God face to face, right? When you actually now see with your eyes the truth of everything he revealed. So faith has a certain amount of darkness around it, right? But it's no less certain. And it's certain because of the one who has spoken. And by the way, have any of you ever heard that Jesus had faith? Has anyone ever heard that? Okay, totally reject that. Jesus did not have faith, right? Because Jesus had the beatific vision from the moment of his conception, right? Which means he saw God face to face, which means he didn't need faith. Right? Blessed Virgin Mary needed faith, but Jesus did not. Okay, and he didn't have hope either. All right, so faith and hope pass away with the vision of God, and charity is the only thing that remains. All right, and remember I said earlier about virtues being sort of the mean between two extremes, and we'll talk about this in just a minute. The mean between, for faith, is between doubt and credulity. And we're going to talk about doubt in just a second, because I want to spend a minute doing that. Okay. All right, so I want to read this quote because St. John Henry Newman, I think, captures the spirit of the world. But what I want you to think about is I remember having a conversation with someone and they said this person had faith. So that he's a man of faith, but he didn't have correct faith. Right? So he wasn't Catholic. All right. He didn't believe, and this is not, I'm not making this about, I don't mean it this way in the sense of like that non-Catholics can't have the virtue of faith. What I mean though, is that right belief actually matters. Okay. What we believe actually matters. And this is what John Henry Newman is saying. He's saying that truth and falsehood in religion are but matter of opinion. All right, he's saying all these things. At the end, he'll say, this is the principle of philosophies and heresies, which is very weakness. That truth and falsehood in religion are but matters of opinion. Okay, we've all heard that. That one doctrine is as good as another. That the governor of the world does not intend that we should gain the truth. That there is no truth. That we are not more acceptable to God by believing this than believing that. That no one is answerable for his opinions. That they are a matter of necessity or accident. That is enough if we sincerely hold what we profess. So all that matters is sincerity. That our merit lies in seeking. It's about the climb, not about the destination. Not in possessing. That it is a duty to follow what seems to us true without fear, lest it should not be true. Right? So thine own self be true. That belief belongs to the mere intellect, not to the heart also. That we may safely trust to ourselves in matters of faith and need no other guide. This is the principle of philosophies and heresies, which is the very weakness. Right? So we said earlier, and what this really is, what I want to sort of talk about is what we probably would call cafeteria Catholicism. All right, and how harmful it is for people to hold that. Okay, so a person who looks at the teachings of the church and decides which are true and which are false on their own, is that faith? Not in God. Why? What is the problem with that? Yeah, they're trusting in their own opinion, right? And this is why we can't pick and choose, because our faith is in the one who said it. If you actually believe the one who said it, then you take everything he said, and you don't go, well, I agree with that. I don't agree with that. I agree with that. I don't agree with that. All right. And so what that ends up doing is damaging faith. All right. Believe, St. Augustine says, so that you may understand. All right. So belief first, then understanding comes. Because you trust God, right? And then he's spoken. Right? And there's situations, of course, right, where did God really say that? And I don't mean in a demonic way, right? There are open questions whether something has been revealed or not. That's not the point, right? But things that are very clear that God has revealed, then for you to form your own opinion is an act against faith, okay? And it destroys your, like we just said, right? A sin against faith destroys your faith. So we believe so that we might understand. All right. So that being said, how do we dispose ourselves for increase of faith? So John Henry Newman, you guys know his story, right? That he was an Anglican priest in the I think he converted like 1848 or something like that. So at the time, like Anglicanism was kind of going in two different directions. And he looked and he was trying to find the truth. And he couldn't seem to find the truth. But he turned to a Catholic priest and had a conversation with him, and then had a conversation with another Catholic priest and another Catholic priest, and they all said the same thing. And he said, how can Anglicans say one Anglican say this, one Anglican say this, but every single one of the Catholics all say the same thing? And so he began to investigate the truth of Catholicism, right? And he's the one who said, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. So he sort of went back and had this intellectual conversion where he went back and he said, okay, what if I look back at the history of the church? Was it Catholic or Anglican? And he finds that it's Catholic. But he clearly wrestled with, in the midst of this intellectual conversion, right? Because the intellectual conversion is not enough, right? It's not enough. In fact, that's not even, faith is not just assent to a bunch of propositions, right? It's assent to the propositions because God has said them, right? So it certainly clears the way. So even the person who finds that the church is intellectually coherent, like like Newman did, it's still not there. So anyway, so he wrestled with the idea of faith, all right, and what it actually means. And so he has, among his sermons, he has this one for the on dispositions of for increase of faith, right? So remember I said, technically we can't actually grow in faith on our own. We can only dispose ourselves, right? And I think we mentioned this a little bit last week. And the reason why I keep sort of pounding this home is because if you want to increase in faith, what are you supposed to do? Ask for more, right? Like that's the idea, all right? But there are certain things we can do that dispose us for God to pour more into our lives, right? So this is what we're going to talk about. So faith is this a foundation, right? And the deeper you build a foundation, the higher the edifice you can put on top of it, right? So Newman says, with good dispositions, faith is easy. Right? Faith is easy with good dispositions. And that without good dispositions, faith is not easy, okay? And that those who were praised for their faith were such as had already the good dispositions, and that those who were blamed for their unbelief were such as were wanting in this respect, and would have believed or believed sooner had they possessed the necessary dispositions for believing, or a greater share of them. Okay, what is he talking about? Well, first and foremost, faith is a gift, right? It's a gift. You cannot do anything to merit it, right? So like this, people who do not have faith will see the world totally differently than we do. But in a certain respect, like God is waiting to give it to them. But on the other hand, we can't browbeat them for not having it. All right. And so what he's saying is that in the Old Testament, especially, this is where he sort of comes from this, comes at this, is he goes, okay, why was Moses punished for hitting the rock? Why didn't he get into the promised land? Does anyone know? Yeah, because God spoke and said, hit it once, right? And what did he do? Well, he didn't say hit it once. He just said, hit the rock, right? And he thought, he presumed that it was his power that would cause it to happen, right? And so what is that supposed to be, right? Like it's supposed to show us, right, that a sin against faith can keep us out of the promised land. And not that it sort of disqualified Moses from the eternal promised land. But the point is that when St. Paul says that faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness, it was really Abraham's disposition to receive faith that was worthy of praise, right? And so what we have to do is dispose ourselves to receive faith. That's what we do on our part. All right, so how do you do that? All right, the first is to make acts of faith. What does an act of faith look like? Well, the creed, right? And to say it and mean it. What happens if I don't really mean it? What if I, have a little bit of doubt in there, or I just kind of go through the motions? What do I do? So, all right, so this is where I wanted to talk about this. So if I do not, if I believe those things are true, but it's only in my head, right? So remember I talked last week, we talked about like what makes the Summa so beautiful, right? Is that St. Thomas, he actually lived it, right? It wasn't just, so what if I just sort of are at the stage of, I'm only intellectually assenting to, I don't know, Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. It doesn't really matter what it. Is that doubt? Or is that weak faith? What does doubt look like? Let's go back to that. What would doubt look like? Yeah, I mean, doubt is intellectual, but what would it look like? So take anything of the creed. Let's just say the communion of saints. That's an easy one to. Yeah. Okay, so if I don't fully believe the communion of saints, what should I do? Yeah, right. So it starts by simply just going like, God, I struggle with this. Like, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, right? Like most of the problem, like we don't ask for that. And we think, well, my faith is just, weak. So don't be afraid. And the way that it grows is to do it again. Yeah, unbelief would be like the impossibility of it, like in your mind, like that can't be, like not ruling it out in a sense of like, but just saying, no, it can't be, right? Yeah, I think I probably would just leave it like in a certain sense, you've ruled it out as a possibility. There might be an openness there, but at this stage, I've closed the door on that.
So maybe like the difficulty of something to it.
Well, no, it would be the difficulty of the intellect accepting the mystery of it usually, right? Is usually where the issue is because it's faith, right? So the way, again, I believe in the communion of saints. I make that act of faith, but say why you believe in it. Because you have revealed it, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. Right? Do not be afraid in prayer to go to God with the things that you're struggling to believe. It's a pretty unbelievable story. Like the whole thing is pretty unbelievable. The God of the universe wants to come and talk to me. Like that's pretty unfathomable. Like if that doesn't knock you really sit there and go, wait a second. Right? But go back to the personal nature of faith and remind yourself who said it. And then you're trusting the person, right? Believe so that you might understand. All right, so make acts of faith. Studying the faith enables you to assent to it more firmly, right? If I've understood, the connection between, Eve and the new Eve, it's way easier for me to make a firmer assent to the belief in the Immaculate Conception. So that's why we study the faith, right? And that then disposes us to have more faith. Teach the faith. Right? If you really want to sort of learn something and study it, the best way to do it, to teach the faith. And then the fourth is to openly profess the faith to other people. God always rewards the person who does that with more faith. All right, questions about faith. Do not be shy. Remember, we talked about it. I think we talked about this last week, but when you begin to pray, especially when you start mental prayer, there are 4 things you should do at the very beginning. First is to recognize that you're in God's presence. Okay, that's the first and most important thing, that he's always present to you, but now you're turning and acknowledging him. And then the next 3 things are to make acts of faith, hope, and love. Okay. And to be, again, explicit in your acts of faith, hope, and love. All right. Let's talk about hope. Hope is the theological virtue by which we desire the kingdom of heaven and eternal life as our happiness, placing our trust in Christ's promises and relying not on our own strength, but on the help of the grace of the Holy Spirit. Virtue of hope responds to the aspiration to happiness which God has placed in the heart of every man. It takes up the hopes that inspire men's activities and purifies them so as to order them to the kingdom of heaven. It keeps man from discouragement. It sustains him during times of abandonment. It opens up his heart in expectation of eternal beatitude. Okay, so faith is in the intellect, hope is in the will, and it essentially is what sustains us and keeping our will directed to God. And again, hope has God as its object. So why do we hope for eternal life? Because it's life with God. Right? So the Catechism said, it keeps man from discouragement. How does that work? What is discouragement? Well, the word means to take away your courage, right? takes away your courage because life is hard, right? In many cases, people will look at things and think it's like a crisis of faith, but it's really a crisis of hope. Because hope is essentially, it's like faith directed to the future. It's the fact that in the midst of what's going on now, God has made certain promises, and I know he always delivers. Right? And that becomes a habitual way of looking at things. And so discouragement always comes up when we depend upon when we think things are depend upon me. Think about that. Whenever you've been discouraged, right? You had plans for it to go this way, it went this way. And so now you're discouraged. You're like, why did I even bother? Why did I do it that way? So how is hope then the remedy for that? Because God has a plan and he never wastes anything. God never wastes anything, right? Always, 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 always at work. All right, hope also increases our energy in the spiritual life, right? And one of the ways you do that is to increase your hope is to meditate on our future, like meditate on where you're going and see if that doesn't far exceed the amount of effort you're putting into it. That can really energize you. So hope, in a certain sense, hope is a virtue that puts all these holy desires in us, right? Those sort of unspoken yearnings that keep us moving. Hope, the two opposites are despair and presumption. Right? So despair essentially says, things will never get better. God can't be in this. God isn't doing this. Right? Presumption is the sort of running away and the sort of infidelity to the grace of the moment that God's bringing, right? So it's just, God will just give me graces when I need them, but not taking advantage of when God sends them, right?
Would you say that the idea of like once saved, always saved is like presumption?
I was totally presumption. Totally presumption. Okay, so virtue of hope. How do we exercise hope and how do we grow in hope? St. Paul says, "For we are saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why does he hope for? But if we hope for that which we see not, we wait for it with patience." One of the ways to do this sort of like a report card on your hope, increase your hope, is to meditate on the second coming. Right? Everyone knows like what leads up to the second coming, right? Like a lot of suffering. How many of you want to be here when the second coming? So do you want to be here when the second coming, like when it happens, exactly when you want to be like here, right up to it? How many people want to do that? What if I told you that the second coming means Jesus is coming to see you? Does that change anything? It changes a lot, right? Like St. Paul tells the Thessalonians, right? He's like, pray for the second coming. Thy kingdom come. That's what we're asking for, by the way. Yes, Patrick.
Wait, so I'm confused. If we're seeing Jesus presumably every day with Mass, why is it like seeing him in the second coming?
Because you'll see him without the veil of the sacrament over him.
It's just I still don't understand why.
So same person, right? It's sort of like, I hate to say this because don't take this analogy too literally. So a person can be present to you in many, many ways, right? Like he could be present to you in Zoom or face-to-face in person, right? Which one in a certain sense, even though he's present to you both ways, which one is better? Face-to-face, right? So in a certain sense, right, I'm really getting close to like somehow really close to heresy here. So I don't want to.
What a good analogy. The making an act of spiritual communion versus actually receiving like the species of the sacrament?
No, I think it's even more than, so the problem is that he was like, so Patrick's question is a really good question as part of the issue. But it's the same reason. So to answer your question, Patrick, it would be the same thing for the reason why there's no Eucharist in heaven. Okay, like without me going into I'll name a new the Zoom heresy after me or something like. Yeah, because the coming of Christ, you seeing him face to face, is better than seeing him in the Eucharist, even though it's the same person present, because there is a sacramental veil over it, right? And a certain, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Stop, Patrick, stop.
Is it that we wanted sort of like you said that Jesus doesn't have faith because he's seen God, and sort of like we want to need faith. That's Jesus.
No, you will not need faith. Like that is the start of vision, right? Like that's why like it's horrible for some people and heaven for others, right? All right, so back to the point about hope. Sorry, I got a little sidetrack there. So if that's the end game, right? Thy kingdom come. Well, why wouldn't we be willing to suffer anything that causes us, like that's in the way of that? All right, now that is about as bad as it gets. Okay, that's why you meditate on it, right? Because if your desire is so much for the thing at the end, then anything that gets in your way is easy, right? Like if you can, which again is another reason to meditate on purgatory, right? To think about, okay, in purgatory, like their desire for Jesus to see God face to face is growing every day, even though they're suffering, right? Because they realize all of the impediments that were in the way, these stupid things they did during their lives, that they're slowly being taken out of the way and they're getting closer and closer to God. And they're being made right with God. Meditate on that and then ask God to let you live purgatory now. That's a scary prayer. That's a really scary prayer, right? But that's how you exercise hope. Because purgatory now, as bad as it sounds, way better than purgatory later. Well, also because you have the help of grace in purgatory, you're on your own, right? You have the help of grace here, there, like you're purified by suffering. Here, your sufferings are united to Christ in the flesh. So purgatory in a certain sense is like, that's why the saints pray it and ask for it now. Yeah, including your own, right? So that part is non-trivial, by the way. Your sufferings here have merit. Your sufferings in purgatory do not. There is a question, I hate to go down this rabbit hole, but there's a question whether the suffering souls in purgatory can pray for other people. That may be, like, that's one of those sort of open questions. So that's why I said your own, because it's meritorious for you for sure, but maybe not for other people in that way. Okay, so how do we grow in hope? That's one way, right? Because ultimately what almost all of our obstacles relate to fear of suffering. Right? Almost every one of your obstacles to real growth relates to fear of suffering. And hope tramples fear of suffering. Right? Hope will absolutely run over a fear of suffering. And again, if you're scared to suffer, well, talk to Jesus about it. Increase my hope. Another way to increase your hope is to practice detachment. Okay, what does detachment look like? Detachment is to look at something and just simply say, is this good for my spiritual growth or not? If it's good, keep it. If it's not, no. No matter how good the thing appears. All right? Not to prefer anything but what God has given you in God's will. Penance is another way, and we're going to talk more about this when we talk about mortification. Right? Penance opens up our hearts to receive hope because it ends up diminishing both presumption and despair. because when you're willing to do penance, you're not presuming anything. You're not presuming that I don't have to do anything to be saved, right? And you're not despairing because you recognize that God is going to take your tiny sufferings and unite them to Christ and use them to save you. Acts of patience, right? Also increase our hope. Patience in the sense of waiting to see what God is doing, right? Being comfortable, not really grasping what's going on and waiting for God to show you what is going on. That's the kind of patience I'm talking about, right? So I'm stuck somewhere and I'm like, wow, what a giant waste of time. Like I think that and I immediately go, uh-oh, I need to go because God doesn't waste time. He's given me a certain amount of time. What is God doing here? Having the patience to let God sort it out. And all of those dispose us to increase in hope. Charity. Charity is the theological virtue by which we love God above all things for his own sake and our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. So charity is essentially friendship with God. And like all friendship, it implies a shared life. And so it's loving what God loves with his love and the way he loves. So when we talk about growth in the spiritual life, we talk about the growth in sanctifying grace. It's also a growth in charity, right? As our spiritual life grows, we love God and our neighbor more and more like God loves. So we're caught up in God's love and we begin to share in his love. Charity can't be diminished, but it can be lost. Right? One mortal sin and it's lost. Right? Yes. Venial sin does not wound charity in the sense of diminishing it. Right. So wound is probably not even a good analogy to use for that. Right. Now your charity can grow cold in a certain sense, right? Where it's not operative because you have a bunch of venial sins in the way. But it can't be like wounded, probably just isn't a good word to use to describe it. All right, so when we're virtuous and all the evil, the sort of inside of us get out of the way, charity begins to take over. All right, so the greatest of these is charity. This is partially from today's reading. If I have not charity, says the apostle, I am nothing. Whatever my privilege, service, or even virtue, if I have not charity, I gain nothing. Charity is superior to all the virtues. It is the first of the theological virtues. So faith, hope, charity abide, these three. The greatest of these is charity. All right, so in the ordering of the virtues, charity is the most important because it unites us to God. And so it's related to all the virtues. Not too far. The practice of all the virtues is animated and inspired by charity, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. It is the form of the virtues. It articulates and orders them among themselves. It is the source and goal of their Christian practice. Charity upholds and purifies our human ability to love and raises it to the supernatural perfection of divine love. You guys know the verse from St. James, like show me your works and I'll show you my faith. And you know how it goes, right? But we kind of look at it as like apologetic, but it's saying something really important about our actions. And so I want to ask a question. An atheist and a Christian, this is not a joke, by the way. Atheist and a Christian walk into a soup kitchen, right? They're both there to feed the poor. What's the difference? Yes, Michael. Yeah, so you guys, what Michael said is really, really, really important. The Christian, when he's animated by charity, does it first, I'm going to add words to what you said, but does it first out of a love for God and as an overflow of the love for God, a love for the neighbor, for his first and foremost, his spiritual good, right? He desires first and foremost that his actions will contribute to saving that person. The atheist can do it for perfectly good natural reasons. The person's hungry, trying to be compassionate. But this is what one of the issues with an overly, an obsession with social justice in the church, right? It tends to just look at the temporal good of the person. That's never the motivation. Right? The motivation is always, or ought to be always, the salvation of souls. Glory of God, salvation of souls. Everything we do, glory of God, salvation of souls. Yes.
They brought back like the devil's advocate or something through this like atheist speaker for canonization. And like the one thing he said against her that stood out to me was that he wasn't happy that she was more concerned about the salvation of the souls that she was working with than or they like that they actually get that.
Wait, so he said that was the problem.
Yeah, he said that was the problem because this guy was there.
Yeah. Yeah, so that she was a saint because that was her fundamental motivation. Right. And when you do that, right, I think we talked about this a little bit last week about Jesus said, I never understood this until I experienced it, but Jesus said, let your works so shine before men. Like I hear that first part, I'm like, okay, that they notice it and they're like, oh, that guy's really good. And I wonder what the source of his goodness is. They don't do that. They say, so that they may give glory to God. So that they almost see through like your actions to the movement, what caused them to happen, right? This is at the heart of like a supernatural outlook. Right? And supernatural actions, like when charity is operative, it's a supernatural thing. So of course the person intuits that they've been touched by God, right? And like you saying St. Teresa is a great example because there were all these times where people would see Jesus like standing beside her and she lived in such darkness and people would just be like this and she would just go, you see him, don't you? Right? She would just know that like she couldn't see him, but people were literally around her seeing Jesus. That's exactly what like ought to motivate us, right? And so like in my own life, that passage never made sense to me until we went into Central Prison, gave a retreat. And at the end of the retreat, these guys are all lifers, right? Some guys had been on death row. Most of them weren't going anywhere, right? And there's like 4 or 5 guys who at the very end decide they're going to get up and give a witness talk, right? And there was one theme in both of these 2 guys who I'm thinking of who actually stuck. Some of them are a little manipulative, so you don't always know what they're doing. But these 2 guys both said the same thing. I have never seen the unconditional love of God. Right? I can't believe that God came in here and found me. You know, not one of those guys said thank you to like, and I was totally okay with that. No one said thank you to me. No one. Because they had somehow experienced God. And they knew who it was. They weren't like, wow, Rob was really good doing this. Like, wasn't even across their mind. And it totally finally dawned on me, like what that actually meant, right? That it was totally fine to just almost be invisible. Because here's the thing that you have to be convinced of, right? You have to be convinced that like God's love working through you is far more effective than anything you could possibly do. And that's why when you go into the soup kitchen, you do it differently. Like you do it for a way different motivation. Because it only takes a little touch, right? A little touch from God for somebody to go, I was just touched by God. Okay, so a Christian can do the same exact thing as an atheist. And this is why we have to be really careful about not getting overly caught up in like social causes. They're good and you should do them. Don't get me wrong. Like you should help people when you can help them. But always, 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 always aimed at the supernatural good, right? Always aimed at their salvation. What that looks like in a soup kitchen, it's just you're carrying it around with you. Maybe you don't feel like you're doing anything different than the atheist is, but you carry it around with you. I promise. All right. The infused moral virtues. So the obvious, you asked like the obvious, I didn't go through a whole list of how to increase virtue of charity. But the obvious is to love God and love your neighbor for his sake. All right, so let's go to the infused moral virtues. Wisdom, chapter 8, verse 7 talks about it. Or if one loves righteousness, remember righteousness in the Old Testament is holiness, whose works are virtues. Okay, so the holy person, their works are virtues. He teaches moderation. He's going to name the virtues. Moderation and prudence, righteousness and fortitude. Righteousness, there is justice. And nothing in life is more useful than these. So the four, what we call the four cardinal virtues. So as great as the theological virtues are, they're in relation to God, and the infused moral virtues are in relation to creatures, right? So how we act towards in relation to creatures, and not just the sense of the creatures in the like Ignatian sense, not just like little rabbits and other people, but just things that are created. When I say that, all right. So they essentially just govern how we relate to created things as means towards our salvation. Okay. All right, so let's look at prudence. Some of these we will keep coming back to. Prudence is the virtue that disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. Prudent man looks where he is going. It is not to be confused with timidity or fear that often people will call someone a prude, right? That's what they're talking about. Nor with duplicity or dissimulation. So in other words, they would call worldly prudence, where you're just kind of manipulating things to get them to work out for yourself. It is called the charioteer of the virtues. It guides the other virtues by setting rule and measure. With the help of this virtue, we apply moral principles to particular cases without error and overcome doubts about the good to achieve and the evil to avoid. All right, so prudence is applying moral principles to particular cases. Right? Supernatural prudence or infused prudence applies faith, right? The principles of faith to practical things. Right? I begged prudence and prudence was given to me. Another line from wisdom. All right, so prudence tells us essentially when to act, how to act, and for how long to act. And essentially it goes back to what I said earlier about indifference, right? So prudence just says, how do I use the things of creation for my supernatural end? Yes. Yeah, you'll hear it called the queen or the charioteer or yes. Okay, so how do we grow in prudence? Ask, prayer, like all the other ones. So one of the things that I want to talk about, and we're going to talk more about this when we talk about mental prayer. One of the ways to grow in all the virtues is to reflect on the life of Christ. Right? So he perfectly performed all virtuous actions. Why? So that he could empower us to do the same thing. Right? So Christ, again, he's a model, right? But not just a model. He's the cause of those virtues in us, right? Because they're supernatural. Christ exercised them. So if you're struggling with a virtue, the best thing to do is to go meditate on Christ actually exercising that virtue. St. Thomas says that if you want to meditate on Christ's virtues, then study the Passion, because he every single virtue is on display there. But so you meditate upon with Christ exercising that virtue, and then ask him to give you the grace to do the same. Because he won the grace at that moment, right? When Christ exercises humility, what did he do? Well, he merited grace for you to grow in humility. You just need to ask for it. We will talk more about this in 2 weeks when we talk about the Sermon of Spirits. So St. Ignatius has his principle of foundation, which we talked a little bit about indifference. But prudence is essentially referring everything to our last end. All right, we'll come back to that next time we meet. Next virtue is justice. Yes.
So when we talk about infused virtues, we talk as just taking for example, we're talking about something that makes you more prudent, but in the sense that it actual grace that elevates my ability to do prudence, or we're saying this brings to like a new supernatural level.
The second. So it brings like prudence is now on a supernatural level. Like on your own, right? No matter how perfectly you exercise prudence, you could never know what the prudent thing to do in relation to heaven is. Right? But with infused prudence, you do. And you know in this, and you've probably I'm sure you've had situations where you've exercised it, where you've gone, like everything on a natural level says this is a good thing, but I think it would be harmful to my spiritual good, and you don't do it.
So is it things like, for instance, going to mass, you couldn't naturally ever get to the idea that I need to. You might get to that at any worship job, but you couldn't naturally get to the idea that I need to go to mass or something like that. So is that supernatural prudence then? Or is it talking about things like more?
No, so remember, it's like prudence is related to practical things. So like going to mass is a commandment. Like that's like I don't know. Going to mass is not a good example, but say a job, right? Like you go through and you're like naturally, oh, this makes sense, and then supernatural prudence might say to you, oh, that's going to harm your spiritual life, and so I'm not going to do it.
So I guess is it something that applies? Is it applying rule? Is it applying principles to practical situations, or is it more related to discernment? Do you see that?
Yeah, it's more related to just like practical, like it factors into discernment for sure. And when we talk about discernment, like prudence would be part of it, but it's more like prudence. Discernment also like tends to be deliberative, right? Like where you really have to deliberate, where prudence just goes in the moment, knows this is the right thing to do at the right time, in the right way, to the right amount, right? So that it's more of that. So maybe the question of a job, like that's probably more of a question of discernment, but maybe somebody's asking you to do something that you have to make a decision right here and now. And like you go, okay, that would be harmful to my spiritual good, I won't do it. Or that would be good. Like it's the flip side of it too, right? Like we do like Mother Teresa going to like India, right? Like natural prudence would say, okay, that's really stupid. Like that, you want to get a whole bunch of people together and follow you. Why would you go there? Supernatural goes, oh no, that's exactly what I should do. I think the other example that just immediately came to mind. Well, no, I won't go there. I think it's clear. Okay, justice. Justice is the moral virtue that consists in the constant and firm will to give their due to God and neighbor. Justice towards God is called the virtue of religion. Justice towards men disposes one to respect the rights of each and to establish in human relationships the harmony that promotes equity with regard to persons and to the common good. Okay, so infused justice is the supernatural habit of rendering to each person what they're due. Okay, so it's different from charity, right? Charity, justice is certainly part of charity. Justice gives someone what they're due, whereas charity gives them something that is yours, that is due to you. Okay. Let's talk about two aspects of this.
I have a question.
Sure. Yeah.
What does it mean at the bottom? It says it promotes equity with regard to persons and typical
Yeah, so equity, not in the sense that it's used now, but more in the sense of in the face of need, like rights, you don't favor one person over another. Right? What they're owed, or even obligations, one or the other, doesn't matter. But equity in the truest sense, not in the sense that we tend to, it's not manufactured. All right, so let's talk about two aspects of justice. Again, we've talked about justice before. I want to talk about forgiveness. Okay, so again, one of those things that sort of puzzled me for the longest time. So Jesus in the Beatitudes, or in the Sermon on the Mount, says to turn the other cheek. But then later when he's struck, he doesn't turn the other cheek. He just says, why did you hit me? Right? It's a little odd, right? Like a little odd until you think about what the purpose of forgiveness is. All right. So Jesus, in a certain sense, is asking the high priest servant to answer the question so that Jesus can forgive him. Okay. So what is forgiveness? Because this is something we all struggle with, right? And it's tied up with, especially with supernatural justice, right? What's the goal of forgiveness, first of all? Why is this so important to forgive? Okay, so reestablish a relationship. What kind of relationship? Okay, Christ-centered for sure. So think about, why did I throw this in with justice? Yeah, a just relationship with the other person. Right? So the relationship is because that's the minimum in a certain respect of willing the good of another person. Right? So even if justice isn't the complete form of love, it certainly is a start, right? And oftentimes, right, like loving your neighbor, like the best you can do is make sure that they're justly treated. So when justice is to give the other its due, there's this sort of principle of reciprocity there, right? That we can treat someone justly while they treat us unjustly, right? And so there's a difference between forgiveness given and forgiveness sought, or even forgiveness received. This is where I think we start to struggle a little bit, right? So Christ commands us what? To forgive practically an infinite number of times, right? Well, what if forgiveness is not sought? Right? So a lot of our time we spend, right, like forgiving people who may not even realize what they did. They don't care what they did. And that's really, really hard. Right? So the point is, right, forgiveness can only be offered to someone. It's up to them as to whether they want to receive it. And so what forgiveness means is restoring justice between the two people. So simple things, right? Like in a family, right? Like the wife does something to really irritate the husband, and let's just say it's bad enough that he's justified in being angry with her, right? Forgiving her means that he renders to her what is due to her as a wife. He might stay angry for a little while longer. I mean, it could even be something serious, right? But at no point, forgiveness would mean rendering to her what is due to her as wife. Okay. So offering forgiveness to someone means that you still will their good. And it's often it can be incredibly liberating to do that. Like to will the good of someone who has wronged you. So what would it mean to forgive someone who like murdered a family member. Let's just take that because it's a pretty extreme example. Connor, what would that look like? Okay, so first, like not seeking, let's just say they've been arrested, right? Should you want them to have a just trial? Because that's what's owed to them, right? Should you want them to be justly treated during their punishment? Yes, right? Does it mean that you guys will be friends someday? No, right? But yeah, maybe in the end, right? Maybe in the end, maybe you'll sit around and laugh about it, right? So it's not forgiving and forgetting. Okay, so that being the idea, right? That it's not forgive and forget. Relationships also require trust. Right? And so very often forgive might mean that you will the good of the other person, but that you don't participate in that good with them. Right? There's plenty of times like there's abusive relationships, like you could will the good of the person, but they're not trustworthy and you don't trust them. And to not trust them, that's not unforgiveness. That's just simply prudence. Right? So you still will their good. So I think I've shared this story before, but my mom, who recently passed away, the last conversation we had was her yelling at me for letting them try to revive her. It was really hard conversation. She was really mad at me, really mad at me. And it was an acute situation. In hindsight, I would have done the same thing and all of that. But that took a lot of like forgiveness to like not have that have that looming over like my entire like relationship with my mom, right? Like, and the way it was a supernatural gift that I was just simply able to forgive her and ask God to forgive her. Right? And once you pray for somebody else's forgiveness, you now offer the suffering that they caused you for their benefit, for their good. That's how on a supernatural, this is why forgiveness is divine. Like that's why it's so hard. Like when someone wrongs you and you're having difficulty forgiving them, ask God first to forgive them. And then offer the suffering for that person. And forgiveness doesn't seem as hard then. Okay. All right. Questions about forgiveness? All right. What about the virtue of religion? Again, we talked about this last semester. What I want to talk about here specifically is about how the Mass is right and just when the sacrifice is being made. So St. Thomas says the only precept of the natural law that we cannot fulfill is related to the virtue of religion, because we can never render to God what is due. But through the Mass, God has made it so that we can offer perfect worship to God. Why? Why is that perfect worship? Why is the Mass perfect worship? Yes, Katie. Yeah, it's God giving to God perfect worship, right? The perfect sacrifice because it's God giving to God perfect worship. And so we get to participate in that. Think about that for just like, even just a second, right? Like what a gift Catholics have because they have the ability to offer to God the perfect worship in the Mass. This is at the heart, by the way, of, even though it's been really, really abused, the Second Vatican Council, when they talked about the idea of drawing a blank on. Yes, full conscious and active participation. Right? It didn't really mean like everyone running around during the Mass. It meant like being conscious of what was going on and participating in it. So see if your spirituality in the Mass doesn't change, if you don't, let's say get more out of Mass, but if you don't, your participation in Mass doesn't, when you begin to look at it as a sacrifice. Everyone remember the 4 ends of prayer, like the 4 things you pray: adoration, thanksgiving, reparation or forgiveness, sins, and petition. All 4 of those things Christ fulfilled perfectly. And so all 4 of those things are the purpose of the Mass. So when, this is, by the way, why we offer Masses for certain intentions, right? Because it's part of the Mass, right? We offer it, for the forgiveness of sins. Why do we have the whole entire Eucharistic prayer? As the priest names all the things that we're offering the sacrifice for. Now, the Mass becomes far more personal when you join them in doing that. So have your own sacrifice of adoration. Right? Offer to God acts of adoration during the Mass. Offer to God acts of thanksgiving during the Mass. Like I found like the best time to do this is during the elevation of the host. I'll offer to God acts of adoration and thanksgiving during the first elevation. And in the second elevation, I'll offer for the forgiveness of sins and for a particular petition. And make them personal because you're uniting them with Christ. All right. Let's talk about fortitude and temperance. We'll talk about them quickly because we're going to come back to them. So fortitude and temperance regulate our relationship with things, whereas justice regulates our relationship with people. And so fortitude is the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of the good. It strengthens the resolve to resist temptations and to overcome obstacles in the moral life. The virtue of fortitude enables one to conquer fear, even fear of death, and to face trials and persecutions. It disposes one even to renounce and sacrifice his life in defense of a just cause. So this fortitude is the habit that strengthens our soul against things that are hard to achieve. Fortitude is the thing that helps us during temptation, by the way. I think oftentimes we tend to white knuckle our way through temptations and not actually ask for God's help. But in the midst of temptation, when you ask for God's help, that is one of the times when it disposes you to receive an increase in the virtue of fortitude. One of the things, St. Teresa of Avila talks about this, especially it's kind of relevant to temptations. I think the key to her early on in her spiritual life, she said, was learning how to take, especially her temptations, and map them to the life of Christ. So, I don't know, there was a sister in the parlor speaking ugly about her behind her back, and she walked in to hear it. And so she would take that and map it to a situation where the same thing happened to Christ. Okay. And then she would say, okay, like I'm being conformed to Christ in this way, but his was so much worse. Like he was kissed by the guy who was literally stabbing him in the back. And through that, she would grow and dispose herself, gross especially in the sort of the arduousness of the spiritual life. Okay, so it's a good practice for us to go when things happen to map them, even good things, like map them to Christ's life so that you can unite them to him in those situations. Most of the time, though, fortitude helps us overcome the fear of suffering, the fear of risks, and the fear of effort. Those three things. Like that's pretty much, those are the obstacles, right? Fear of how hard it's going to be, the fear of putting yourself out there, and the fear of suffering. Last virtue, temperance, which we're going to talk about when we, right before Lent, when we talk about penance and mortification. I'll just mention it briefly. Temperance is the moral virtue that moderates the attraction of pleasures and provides balance in the use of created goods. It ensures the will's mastery over instincts and keeps desires within the limits of what is honorable. The temperate person directs the sensitive appetites towards what is good and maintains a healthy discretion. Okay, so it moderates our attraction to sense pleasure, especially those of the palate and of the flesh. One of the ways in which we grow in the virtue of temperance is fasting for supernatural reasons, right? Not just dieting. So there's a difference between dieting would be the natural virtue of fasting, whereas supernatural virtue of fasting is for the remission of sin and to unite yourself with Christ in the desert. All right, questions?